Fish oil supplementation causes cardiovascular disease. What's up, guys? Back with another educational video, and this week we are talking about fish oil. Will it give you cardiovascular disease? But first, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment for the algorithm. Now, before we get started, you may notice we have, finally, wait for it, human randomized controlled trial t-shirts. That's right. Check it out. So, if you love a crazy 40-something-year-old screaming human randomized control trials and giving you the lowdown on the science without all the BS, pick up one of these at the Biolayne store. Click the link in the description. A new study got published which threw the headlines into a tizzy. The take-home was fish oil is going to give you heart disease. That has been the hot takes on social media and in the news. So I went and dug into this study. This study was in the British Medical Journal, and they were looking at the Biobank data, which is a UK data set that they followed up for about 12 years. So they're looking at people at baseline and then 12 years later. Now, they excluded people who had pre-existing cardiovascular diseases, stroke, people who had cancer, but the study itself was actually pretty comprehensive, and I think it was actually a pretty decent study. I think the problem was the hot takes on social media. So let's get into it. They looked at people who either used fish oil or didn't use fish oil as a supplement, and a bunch of other covariates, which quite frankly, there were some small differences in some of these confounding variables between people who used fish oil and people who didn't. But after looking through the data, it really looks like a wash in terms of overall like healthy or unhealthy lifestyle between users and non-users. And they looked at what they called transitions. So they looked at people going from healthy state to atrial fibrillation, healthy state to cardiovascular disease, healthy state to death, atrial fibrillation to cardiovascular disease, atrial fibrillation to death, and they looked at people going from cardiovascular disease to death. Basically, they were looking at each of those increments, how did fish oil supplementation affect the risk of those progressions? Now, I'm going to grab the paper so that I get this stuff completely correct, and I'm going to read you some excerpts from the paper. So amongst those, they really broke it down into different cardiovascular diseases. So they also had transitional pattern 1, which was looking at baseline to atrial fibrillation, baseline to cardiovascular disease event, baseline to death, and then atrial fibrillation to cardiovascular disease, atrial fibrillation to death, and then major cardiovascular disease to death. They had transitional pattern 2, which was baseline to atrial fibrillation, baseline to heart failure, so a different type of cardiovascular disease, baseline to death, atrial fibrillation to heart failure, atrial fibrillation to death, and then heart failure to death. Then again, they did the same thing with stroke, which was baseline to atrial fibrillation, baseline to stroke, baseline to death, atrial fibrillation to stroke, atrial fibrillation to death, and stroke to death. And finally, transitional pattern 4, which was baseline to atrial fibrillation, baseline to myocardial infarction, baseline to death, atrial fibrillation to myocardial infarction, atrial fibrillation to death, and myocardial infarction to death. Okay, so for each of these different types of cardiovascular diseases, they looked at all these progressions, and they wanted to see at these various points, did fish oil have an impact? Now here's where it gets interesting. What you've heard about in the news is that fish oil can give you cardiovascular disease. Well, what the research showed was consistently across all these transitional patterns, fish oil increased your relative risk of going from baseline to atrial fibrillation by 13%. I want to first point out what relative risk is. If someone has an absolute, let's say 10% risk, I'm just making up numbers. If somebody has a 10% risk of atrial fibrillation at baseline over a 10-year period, and their risk increases by 13%, it doesn't go from 10% to 23%, it goes from 10% to 11.3% because it is a relative risk increase. So 13% of 10% is 1.3%. So you add 10 to 1.3 and you get 11.3. That's how I did that math. So again, important to understand, we're not talking about an absolute risk increase, we're talking about a relative risk increase, which on balance is pretty small. So from baseline, healthy people, to atrial fibrillation development, it raised the relative risk by 13%. But what about all these other transitional patterns? For almost all of them, it had a neutral or positive effect. In fact, baseline to atrial fibrillation and baseline to stroke, but oddly enough, not atrial fibrillation to stroke, baseline to atrial fibrillation and baseline to stroke were the only metrics in here that were elevated risk by using fish oil. That's it. Everything else was neutral or positive. I'm going to give you some examples here in a second. So baseline to stroke increased the relative risk by 5%. Baseline to atrial fibrillation, 13% relative risk. Now let's go through and look through all the protective effects that fish oil had. From atrial fibrillation to major adverse cardiovascular event, an 8% relative risk reduction. From baseline to heart failure, 8% risk reduction. From atrial fibrillation to death, an 11% relative risk reduction. From heart failure to death, a 9% relative risk reduction. From atrial fibrillation to death, a 9% relative risk reduction. And from atrial fibrillation to myocardial infarction, which is a heart attack, a 15% relative risk reduction. And atrial fibrillation to death in that transitional pattern, a 12% risk reduction for myocardial infarction, that transitional pattern. That probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense, which is good that you're confused because I'm confused as well. And here's why. So what this data set's telling us is from being healthy, supplementing with fish oil, progressing to atrial fibrillation, fish oil increases the risk, but then reduces the risk for everything thereafter. And let's just look at like baseline to death, because isn't that what we really care about? Does something increase your risk of dying? And at every single transitional pattern, there is basically no effect on baseline to death for fish oil. In fact, there's actually a very small protective effect, but it's just not statistically significant. Why didn't they talk about that? Why didn't the media outlets talk about that? Well, it's because they can't scare you with that. They can't make you afraid with that. So what would explain this? All I can tell you is there's not really many things I've ever heard of that when we're talking about disease progression, that it accelerates the disease at this step, but then reduces the rate of disease progression at another step. Now, there are some studies that suggested that fish oil might have an effect on sodium-potassium pumps, and perhaps that could affect electron gradients, and that could have an effect on atrial fibrillation. Maybe seems kind of thin to me. So there's one here I really want to point out. So this is in transitional pattern 2, which is looking at the progression from baseline to atrial fibrillation to heart failure and then to death. And in that, they see, again, a 13% relative risk increase from fish oil supplementation. But then they see an 8% risk reduction from baseline to heart failure, and they see a non-significant 5% risk reduction in the progression from atrial fibrillation to heart failure, and they see a significant 11% reduction in the progression from atrial fibrillation to death. They also see a 9% risk reduction in atrial fibrillation to death in the stroke category. And again, atrial fibrillation to myocardial infarction, a 15% risk reduction. It just doesn't make sense to me. Now, maybe something will come up later that will show that fish oil elevates the risk of atrial fibrillation and that that's an actual thing. But again, my take home from this paper is that fish oil seems to have a neutral or positive effect on your risk of cardiovascular disease and death. I mean, I guess the worst case scenario you can take out of this is maybe if you're healthy, don't take fish oil and then begin taking it when you have cardiovascular disease. But again, it just doesn't make good sense to me. I don't have data to back this up. This is a gut feeling as a scientist. But I have just seen very few things that taking said thing causes disease to start, but then continuing to take said thing reduces the progression of that disease. I'm not really aware of anything else that does that. I personally can't think of that. And if we look at the human randomized control trials, we see that fish oil supplementation also improves insulin sensitivity in people who are metabolically unhealthy. It reduces blood pressure, it reduces triglycerides, and there's some evidence that it can raise your HDL cholesterol, probably from the improvements in insulin sensitivity. All those things are good for cardiovascular disease. On balance, I'm not freaked out about this data. It's one study. Most of the studies we have on fish oil supplementation, including a huge meta-analysis of cohort studies and randomized controlled trials. Remember, this is just one cohort study. So this was a huge meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials and cohort studies, basically found neutral to positive effects of fish oil supplementation. Do I think fish oil is going to be a game changer for most people? I don't. But I think on balance, the data suggests it's a neutral or positive way to improve your blood lipids, improve your insulin sensitivity, and possibly decrease your risk of major cardiovascular disease. All right, guys, if you liked the video, make sure you support it by buying your human randomized control trial t-shirts, and I'll catch you guys next week.